Hi everybody, I'm Carol Willis, the director of the Skyscraper Museum, and I'm welcoming you to Rewriting Skyscraper History. This is the first of a series of lectures that we are thinking of as a semester. They are going to be paired talks, usually on one night and then another night, and then also available in video, which you may be watching right now. This was an idea that was born a while ago, but through the circumstances of the moment, of platforms and distancing, we had the opportunity to bring together some colleagues of mine from previous years, previous talks at the museum, and you'll be able to hear some of those talks that they have given in earlier years through the links on our website. So we're really thinking of this whole semester as a course that reviews ideas and narratives about skyscraper history and thinks about rewriting it from looking back at the 21st century. So what I'm going to do before I introduce the speakers is to give a very brief overview of some of the issues, to introduce them, that we'll be looking at across these various weeks. So the idea for, let's say, instigated this particular course was an event that happened last October and was very much in the frame of popular histories of the skyscraper. At a conference, that was organized by the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat called First Skyscraper, Skyscraper First, the speakers that will participate in our course kind of came together as co-conspirators against the theme of this conference, which we had been invited to be on the steering committee to set up this idea about the first skyscraper. This took place in Chicago, not incidentally, and there was a kind of mindset to the celebration of a particular building and a popular history of the skyscraper, the home insurance building, and that narrative of it being the first building. So what the scholars that you'll see through the rest of this course kind of coalesced around was a too simple idea of history to which we were being channeled. So this symposium their symposium, the CTBUH's, was called at its outset, the first skyscraper. And what we succeeded in innumerable emails and steering committee meeting and many conversations was to put an S on first skyscraper to make it more than one. And then to also turn the idea into firsts, thinking of first as technology. So this course, this series over this fall, is going to add and layer various narratives on this one kind of determinative definition of the skyscraper, which focuses too much on technology and too much on the story of steel. So here are my colleagues and co-conspirators and the speakers in our series. Jerry Larson, not on this, there's me. Jerry Larson, not in this series, but Gail Fensky, Tom Leslie, you'll be hearing later today, and Donald Friedman, among other architectural historians, architects, and engineers. So our revolt was against this very popular narrative of the first skyscraper being the home insurance building. This is the answer to a search question that you can find on Google and search engines very easily from many different sources. For example, the History Channel. The home insurance building is the first skyscraper. The Guardian, the newspaper, looking at the history of skyscrapers, outstanding buildings, the home insurance building is the first skyscraper. If you go to the Guinness Book of World Records, the home insurance is the first skyscraper. And even if you go to the Getty Research Center, you see a definition of the skyscraper that connects to this narrative of the story of steel and the invention of the steel frame. And as you can see here, the Getty, along with the Society of Architectural Historians, says as a definition of skyscraper, an exceptionally tall buildings of skeleton frame construction. And this narrative is embedded in a modernist story and interpretation of the skyscraper. And as you can see, the young Philip Johnson, back in 1933, framing the issue of the development of the Chicago School as an evolution from masonry to steel. The apotheosis of that, of course, in the history of architecture is a building like the Seagram Building, Mies van der Rohe's great landmark, the great corporate corridor of New York, where the expression of the steel skeleton, the honest expression of structure in the modernist rhetoric, is the culmination of this idea about the evolution from the late 19th century through the mid-20th century. But this was a story that was never quite right because it didn't explain a building like the World Trade Center that you see under construction, which isn't a skeleton frame at all. In fact, it's a tube, right? The structure is on the outside and there's a core. So if that is not true, that a skyscraper was, even in the 20th century, a building with skeleton frame construction, then what should the definition of a skyscraper be today? And that's the second half of the title of our symposium, looking back from the 21st century. So if we look at the world's tallest building today, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, and look underneath the glass curtain wall, you see that the building is made of concrete. It's a masonry building, in effect. It's a load-bearing wall. So clearly not made of steel, although steel is involved. Clearly not a skeleton structure. It's a pure gravity load structure. And you can see even in a collection of building plans, all taken from the exhibition that we're about to open, or we hope we'll be able to open to the public in August, called Super Tall. Here are the works about a dozen of the world's tallest buildings, and you can see there's hardly a column in sight, and there's certainly not a grid. So there are cores of masonry, there are gigantic cores, there are mega columns, there are all sorts of structural systems that basically frame themselves around a heavy masonry core. So not a skeleton of steel. So if we took masonry as an idea to investigate across this course, as is one of the themes that we will explore, and Lee Gray on Wednesday will talk about the early office building in New York City, and he did his dissertation on the Tribune building in New York of 1874. And you can see a model that we made a few years ago, a building that takes masonry and tries to open it up the way the Gothic Cathedral did, to open the wall to light penetration. But that was the problem with the skyscraper, when skyscrapers were still made of masonry, but their defining characteristic, the height, which is one of the alternative narratives of the skyscraper that kind of fought through the 20th century between the technology of structure and the celebration of height with Winston Weissman and others. So in this model, an interesting 19th century question is posed. Where does the building begin? In a masonry building, it begins in the foundations. Here's the foundations. Here's the sidewalk. This is where the building would begin to be measured for its height, but this is where the building begins as structure. So we're going to explore this week and next week ideas about structure and ideas about materials. So to return just briefly to the kind of civic pride and rivalry that has always framed the issues of New York versus Chicago, you can see the upshot of the conference last October of the CTPUH about first skyscrapers in the column that was the coverage of the architecture critic for the Tribune, Blair Kamen. And he says, he notes with some irony and maybe a little irritation, the same people who demoted the Willis as the Sears Tower could strip Chicago of another skyscraper title. So we being the participants of that first symposium and now the kind of central framers of this the second one, are going to look over the course of the course at this series of narratives that will come, we hope, to rethink how we define and create a definition of the skyscraper, no longer wedded to the idea of steel framing. And Tom Leslie, in his book, Chicago Skyscrapers, has already made that more complicated. But we're giving Tom and also Lee Gray the opportunity to talk about a technology. I thought it would be particularly interesting to talk about elevators, passenger elevators, which everyone acknowledges the enabling technology for the skyscraper. That's undeniable. With the idea of elevators in a kind of technological stew of invention, grain elevators, which even predate the tall office buildings. So Tom Leslie's talk is Chicago's Other Skyscrapers, looking at this kind of lost history of the Chicago grain elevators and the development of that typology through the technology of elevators themselves, but also of the introduction of new materials in those buildings, which are monumental and also very tall. So introducing the video of Tom Leslie's talk, and then Tom will be involved in the conversation with Lee Gray after Lee's talk. I want to mention that Tom is a professor, is the moral professor at the Iowa State University, and he is the author not only of that Chicago book, but of books on Nervi, has made a particular study of structural engineering, and has a kind of panoptic view of technology and labor and a whole series of issues that are going to weave themselves through this semester. So now Tom Leslie is going to talk about his Chicago Other Skyscrapers, which is an essay that you can find on our website so that you can read it in full and be fully briefed at any point in all of the rich detail of Tom's study. Thank you.